hopefully everyone can see the slide. So I'm gonna talk for about 10 to 15 minutes and then hand over to Fiona. And it's great to be talking with Fiona here, because this project, as you know, several of you will probably already know if you've seen it, is very much a collaborative venture. So it's been undertaken by the Hunterian in partnership with Fiona, with Panel, an amazing curatorial organization that links artists, designers, and industrial producers often in their work, and thinks really carefully about how to work with art in design contexts. And we've also worked with Dovecote Studios to produce an element of the work, with the Kingston School of Art in London, where Elizabeth Price is a researcher, and with many others as well. And I'm always nervous to forget something, but a lot of people have contributed to this project, and it's great that we're reflecting that by having a bit of a conversation with Fiona today. And there are, I think it's important to say, ongoing elements of the public programme that draw that out even more, and especially a symposium we may return to mentioning at the end of this, that will take place the 24th and 25th of March, and really unpicks a lot more of the issues that are going on in Elizabeth Price's show Underfoot. So I've got some images of the show in case anyone hasn't seen it, just to kick off. And then I'm going to focus on talking about maybe two currents in the work that are not so obviously visible on a first read of the show. And they have to do with the use of the lecture as a kind of structure for how Elizabeth's film work operates, and then a kind of consideration, I suppose, of how certain architectural elements are treated. So first of all, to explain what's in the exhibition for anyone who hasn't seen it, it contains two archival photographs that reflect the research process in the exhibition, in which Elizabeth Price spent time with the Stoddard Templeton business archives held at the University of Glasgow. And you'll see the images again at the end of my lecture, so I won't dwell on them here. It also includes, and this is where Panel and Fiona really began this project before the Hunterian's involvement, with the idea of asking Elizabeth to make a textile work. And through her research and through spending quite a lot of time in Glasgow and visiting different locations, she ended up producing this work, Sad Corel, with Dovecote Studios in Edinburgh. And it's a kind of elaboration of a motif found in the music room of the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, a building that, not unimportantly for this project, is in its modern extension the same vintage as the Hunterian Art Gallery. So they're both buildings from 1981. And Elizabeth elaborated both the kind of vine motif and the vinyl record motif from the music room of the Mitchell Library to make this hand-tufted rug, which is shown on a kind of curved armature that alludes to the corels in the music library that are surrounds. Often they're surrounds for desks. In the case of the Mitchell, they're soundproofed rooms in which you can practice musical instruments. Also in the show is this major new moving image work called Underfoot, from which the show takes its title. It's a 2-channel work, and it takes about 13 minutes to watch the whole thing through. And in it, we first of all encounter the spaces of the Mitchell Library, and then we encounter images of the production of floral carpets. And this is done through amazingly kind of high-end digital animation that is uncannily real. And that technology itself is a kind of outcome of the developments of computing that begin with programmable looms and textile factories. So there's a kind of self-reflexive element to that, but it's also really thinking about the social space of the carpet, and above all, the carpet and flooring as an overlooked or undervalued element of architectural set dressing. And this is true, obviously, in galleries as it is in other spaces. The Mitchell Library's amazing wall-to-wall patterned carpets were a major kind of inspiration for how this film took shape. And what happens, as I suggested in the work, this 2-channel work, is it functions in some ways as a kind of guided tour of the Mitchell Library to begin with. So as we're watching, images appear on each of these 2 screens, text is entered, we hear it being typed in, and then it appears on screen that tells us exactly what we're looking at in a very kind of didactic or pedagogic way, as if we're on a guided tour, or, and this is cued in the film by the fact we hear the kind of clicking sound of a slide changing, as if we're watching a slideshow. So we're in the presence of some kind of expert knowledge that guides us through these spaces. And I think it's really important in the film that this guided tour doesn't pay attention to the carpets until quite late on. There's a sense that what we start with is a more formal presentation of what the institutional space itself designates as important, the subjects of history or topography and so on. It comes to think about the carpets through an acknowledgement that in a library, the management of sound is important. And this is also where the form of the corral, the enclosure for private study, starts to be discussed. So as Elizabeth's script for the film says here, the control of sound in a library is usually achieved through a combination of design, manners, and materials. And parsing the designs, manners, and materials of this space is one of the key preoccupations of the film. We see what architectural structures have been afforded for that, the veneers that have been used to deaden sound, and then eventually the carpets that provide another level of kind of sonic control. As befits this kind of pedagogic, didactic tone, we find throughout that our attention is being directed. So often the use of words like here or elsewhere or meanwhile down on level 1 and so on are used. So our attention is continually being drawn to specific elements that were being shown, as they might be by an art history lecturer giving a class in a darkened lecture theatre. And I want to come back towards the end of my presentation to the use of this language and this direction of attention to what is here, even though within the space of the Hunterian Art Gallery, obviously, these things are not actually here, they're somewhere else. Towards the end of the film, what are called point papers, the gridded up designs that are used to program looms for the production of spool Axminster carpets, are animated and they kind of burst into life. There's a incredibly exuberant, and I think it's fair to say kind of joyful moment when the lecture seems to fade away, the guided tour seems to fade away, and instead we have the coming to life of these floral motifs that erupt from below and spread up over the screens in a kind of really huge release of tension within this film work. And in order to put that trajectory from the lecture into the animation of the floor, into some kind of historical context, and I'm going to do this in an incredibly compressed and sort of probably overly cavalier way, I wanted to go back to a certain kind of history that I think is often in the back of Elizabeth Price's mind when she thinks about the work she's making. A practice that has taken the architectural elements of the gallery, of what we know since the 1960s as the white cube space, as a very important element, and one to be critiqued and questioned, and to have its constitutive role in determining what art can be made clear. So it's broadly the history of a practice that is known as institutional critique, that is artists drawing attention to the determining role of the galleries in which their work is exhibited and questioning the ideological and aesthetic implications of the way these spaces are designed and used. And as a starting point, I wanted to show this image, which I first came across in the very first exhibition I curated at the Hunterian, actually, with an artist called Neil Clements, who made an exhibition that really explored the kind of set dressing that's going on in this photograph. It's an image of kind of art and social capital in a way. An ambitious young gallerist, John Casmin, his backer, Sheridan Dufferin, a marquess and a prominent figure who was bankrolling the thing, the photograph taken by Lord Snowdon and showing the first exhibition of the post-abstract expressionist painter Kenneth Noland in the UK in 1963. This was the opening show for Casman's gallery. There's wonderful modernist furniture. There is high modernist art on the walls. There is a designer ashtray for anyone who wants to smoke while they're looking at these paintings. But there is also a rather wonderful floor. And I'm going to quote here from Lisa Tickner's recent book about, it's called London's New Scene, Art and Culture in the 1960s. Very detailed and rich account of what people like Dufferin and Casman were up to as they tried to make a kind of international art scene happen in London in the swinging 60s. She writes of the setting up of this space. The floor was a tremendous talking point and much admired. Carpet would have been too lush, and floorboards too kitchen sink. ABK introduced Casman to a new kind of Pirelli flooring, invented in Italy and first used in Rome Airport, a sort of ridged, very hard-wearing linoleum, the most up-to-the-minute, advanced heavy-duty flooring of the time. This had just the right semi-industrial look, but it turned out to have two drawbacks. First, because it was ridged, and because it went up to the wall with virtually no skirting, it was a program to clean. As Casman says, we got terrible marks, actually, terrible splash marks on the wall with industrial cleaners, which was absolute agony. And occasionally they hit the bottom of the picture with their flailing. This was true in the Nolan show, apparently. So the very act of keeping this pristine white cube pristine would often damage the art that was shown in it. The second problem that Tickner identifies was that later on, showing other artists, the floor would have to be changed at great expense. Showing the work of Anthony Caro, Tickner writes, Casman had taken on a sculptor for whom flooring was critical. In 1965, the Times observed the gallery had acknowledged this by laying coconut matting over the rubber. But for Caro's show in 1967, Casman purchased a temporary oak floor laid down in sections just for Caro and then taken up again. Unbelievable expense. No wonder I went broke, Casman says. So the gallery ultimately fails because it was so lavish in its attempt to kind of create this perfect atmosphere for art. So this is an example of the argument made famously by Brian O'Doherty in his book, Inside the White Cube, that the kind of semantics of the architecture had become almost as important as the art itself, and that certain kinds of art were incredibly dependent on the seemingly secondary set dressing that provided the backdrop against which they were shown. The tradition by which these kinds of spaces are critiqued also includes a tradition of artists taking on the role of the historian or the lecturer and subverting that to draw attention to the conventions by which we use language to point to art and describe its particularly important values. So in the case of Tickner's argument about the Casman Gallery, the fact that the floor was as important as any other element in the room is ripe for kind of critical exploration. But for many artists, knowing that ultimately critics and historians come to define the terms by which their work will be discussed, there's an interest in occupying that role and subverting it too, not just the architecture, but the language. Robert Morris's piece 21-3 is often taken as a kind of first step along this path. He performed in the guise of an art historian, miming out of time to a recording of a lecture by another famous art historian called Erwin Panofsky, so that when he pours a glass of water, it's kind of comedically out of time with the sound of water being poured and so on. Morris too was fascinated by the relationship between artwork and architectural space. He made works like this, Location from 1963. Wherever it's placed, wherever it's exhibited, you use these little dials that are on its surface to record how far it is from the floor, the wall, and the ceiling. Or Mel Bochner, another conceptual artist this period in 1969, his measurement room, wherever it's exhibited, it simply traces the space that it occupies, measures it as an artist might planning a show. Or later on, kind of another generation of this practice, an artist like Michael Asher, again, looking at what is relatively unexplored in an architectural environment in a gallery that seems to be insignificant and finding ways to draw attention to it. So for his show at Kunsthalle Bern in 1992, he had all of the radiators in the building moved to one location and then like laboriously plumbed into that space. So the way in which the gallery maintains its kind of comfortable temperature for visitors and for art was extended into this kind of labyrinthine, excessive, and highly visible structure. Later, two artists like Louise Lawler looked at the way that artworks as collected objects could be made visible. The fact that they existed not only as idealized images within slide lectures or within museum spaces, but as things owned by private collectors in which they existed with other kinds of visual culture. So in this case, a Jackson Pollock painting next to a elaborately designed soup tureen arranged by prominent collectors, Mr. and Mrs. Burton Tremaine, in their Connecticut home in 1984, something that a museum would never do, becomes visible. And Lawler too is interested in making visible the linguistic and ideological pedagogic devices by which art is given its kind of definitions and values. This is a work that I think about a lot because I give lectures a lot, and it's a work that describes the apparatus of art history, the slide cabinet and the lecture theatre with its dual projection, as the mechanisms of equipment and entrenchment. Entrenchment, that is, of cultural values, of presumptions, of notions about what makes art important in relation to other fields. So Elizabeth, in using the format of a lecture or a guided tour to unpick an architectural environment and thinking about its hierarchies, could be said to be following in something of this tradition. Perhaps also following in the tradition of somebody like Andrea Fraser, who for her a number of works used this alter ego of the museum tour guide, Jane Castleton, to draw viewers' attentions to all of the features of a museum space, this case, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So the bathroom and the cafe as much as the galleries. And in doing so, basically what she did was repeat the language that the institution had used to describe itself in its founding documents, in its publicity statements, and in board meeting notes and so on. So she becomes the performer of all the things that the institution says but does not draw attention to about its own value systems, in this act of kind of drawing attention to what's overlooked or what's underfoot or what's at hand but not within the formal spaces of art. She extended this even further in collaboration with Alan McCollum, making a series of basically identikit artworks, paintings that are surrogates for artworks that are then described as if they're incredibly different by this actor who plays, again, the role of the gallerist or tour guide, telling you what to think about each of these things, as if the value of something comes from a language outside it that is continually being applied to create a kind of performed notion of what it means. And in a wonderful essay by Robert Nelson, The Slide Lecture, or the Work of Art History in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, this critic, Nelson, draws our attention to the performance that is the slide lecture, again, as something that creates value. In the slide lecture, he writes, the image, that shadow or representation on the wall, never remains mere projection, mere being, because it's part of a performative triangle consisting of speaker, audience, and image. Together they create narratives and social bonds and transform shadows into art, monument, symbolic capital, or disciplinary data. Something in underfoot of this interest in how images are creating symbolic capital and data is at work, I think. He goes on to say that a professor gains legitimacy through the cogency of her arguments, the acquiescence of the audience, and the performative frame that enables her to mold the audience's vision. Often the verbal mechanisms of this process in the slide lecture are scarcely noticed common expressions, such as "we see on the left," or "if you look carefully, you may see." Nelson also notes the frequency with which a kind of language called deictics are used. Words like here, now, this. These belong, he says, to conversational situations in which speaker and listener share a common space and time, and hence are usually avoided in standard academic prose. So it's interesting that Elizabeth uses them too, here, elsewhere, this, now, throughout Underfoot, to draw our attention to things that we would normally pass over or normally passed over in standard academic prose and accounts of art. In doing so, I think she's following in a tradition of people who've drawn attention to the features, the architectural and linguistic features that shape what art can be. But her work, importantly, is not only about art or about art history, it's also about social history, and it's about the protagonists. I think we could at least propose that the protagonists speaking in her work are vectors of the experiences of the people who we see in the archives Elizabeth researched. These are the two archival images that feature in Underfoot. We see two women on their hands and knees trimming a newly produced carpet to remove flaws from it. And we see in an image that appears in the film itself, a woman enmeshed within the apparatus of the spool Axminster loom, somebody absolutely kind of in the midst of a technology that is going to remake the world. And it's when it comes out as a kind of the computer technology we know today, but which is also a lived experience with markers of class, of gender, of locality, and so on at stake in it. What's so remarkable in Elizabeth's work to me is how she manages to pick up traditions of critique, traditions of questioning how art is defined, how architectural spaces are read, what is given value, but to give this human voice and human experience its place within an entirely kind of digital universe that she works in. And, you know, could go on and on and on, and I don't want to. So I would really like to hand over to Fiona, who I think might pick up a little bit on the sense of these social experiences as important tones and elements in the work. And thank you, Fiona, for being part of this. And I hope I haven't used up too much of your time.
Thanks, Dominic. I suppose I'm going to take quite a different approach, and I'm not going to talk directly about the exhibition at all. I suppose I want to kind of offer maybe some different ways of experiencing the exhibition or reflecting on the exhibition if you've already seen it. I guess there will be points at which some of what I'm going to read out will connect with some of the images and ideas that Dominic has already talked about. So I am now going to share my screen, and that will go